Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Infrastructure as Code podcast. I'm Ohad Maizlish, your host for today, and we have an amazing guest. We have Ilia Lazebnik. Hi, Ilia, welcome.
Hi, Odd. Nice to be here.
Great. So today it's going to be very special because Ilya is going to talk not about what he's doing on his day job, but what he's doing on his free time. So, but before we talk about your free time, let's talk about what you do on your day job, and then we will switch to Terraform and providers and AWS and things like that. But first, Ilya, tell us a bit about yourself, please.
So I work at Placer.ai. During the day, I'm a software architect and I manage the production engineering team at Placer.
Great. And a few years ago, you started doing something and contribute to an open source. Tell us how it started and what exactly you started doing a few years ago.
Awesome. So I think almost 4 years ago, I started actually my journey to the cloud, my previous company. And when looking at how to automate stuff, we obviously chose Terraform, working on AWS. And soon enough, found some gaps in what we can automate. And I've decided to fill those gaps by contributing to the AWS provider. And I found that it's very nice. People are very receptive, and there's a large community out there of both contributors and people who are asking for help. And I've decided to contribute more stuff, not only things that I need. And I've been doing this, yeah, now for almost 4 years.
You said contributing a little, a bit more than just a little. Um, so AWS Terraform Provider, for those who are not aware of the data of this massive provider, uh, has almost 9,000 GitHub stars. But maybe more interesting is that it has 2,800 contributors, 2,800 contributors. And Ilya is ranked number one in this huge list, uh, who is not a HashiCorp employee. So you're not getting paid for contributing for the AWS Terraform provider. You just decided to spend a lot of time and being the number one non-HashiCorp employee for contributing to this AWS provider. I looked at some data, and Ilya contributed about 200,000 lines of code to the Terraform provider of AWS, doing close to 2,600 commits. So now, after we have this crazy information, let's explain maybe to our audience what is the Terraform AWS provider and what is a provider, a public provider, maybe a private provider. But what is a provider? Why Terraform needs providers?
Okay, so actually, historically, Terraform had all of its providers as part of the single binary. AWS, Azure, Google. I'm not sure even Google was there back then, but Terraform decided to go to a very pluggable architecture where everybody can use the core language of Terraform, HCL, and have an abstraction to allow them to manage the resources of their respective tool. AWS, Azure, Bitbucket, whatever. Anything that has basically CRUD operations and you can manage its state, you can create a provider for in Terraform. Basically, that's that. Because these are, imagine those as plugins to the larger Terraform executable.
Yeah, so the biggest Terraform providers are AWS, Azure, GCP, but you have also providers for other solutions such as Datadog or New Relic or Auth0 or Okta or whatever needs to be managed by code. And AWS is the biggest provider. Lots of changes, commits, and updates to this provider. And AWS is also public provider, unlike a private provider. Can you explain what is a public provider versus a private provider?
Yeah, so a public provider is a provider that can anyone can use, can download. When you use your Terraform locally or in your automation, you declare what kind of integrations you want to use if you're managing AWS, Azure, and you can just download it and it's versioned, meaning there are updates, and every time usually it's weekly for AWS at least, and every time there's updates, new resources, bug fixes. Um, you can get those updates that instead of a private provider, which you would manage maybe inside your own company and having your internal abstractions that are not supposed to be public for everyone, and those can be used internally by your other departments in the company. For example, if you have, I don't know, some internal platform where developers can create internal services or internal resources or tickets, and you can actually abstract that for your company internally as well.
Okay, but let's be honest here. Private providers are far less common than the public providers, and most companies don't really need too many or at all public providers. But basically, every Terraform developer uses several Terraform providers in order to provision and update resources. Um, and just to make sure we are not confusing providers with modules, what are Terraform modules?
So modules would be a higher level of abstraction for the providers, assuming you want to have certain architectures or constructs. You would abstract them with a module. Imagine it like a function that does something very specific. Instead of having a needing to repeat every time whatever you need. For a common example in AWS would be a VPC and some subnets and a load balancer and a VM. And if it's something that is common enough inside your company or common enough outside where everybody would want to reuse it, you would package it as a module. Yeah.
Great. So I don't need to just use the provider resources directly. I can group them into one module, and that will save me time to do repeatable things as a module. So the combination of module and provider is basically the best practice to use Terraform. Okay, great. So providers, AWS. Let's say now AWS releases some new capabilities. When and how those things will be available uh, within the provider.
Okay. So as all providers are, basically they're an abstraction over the public API of a given vendor, for AWS, for example. And the AWS provider uses the Go SDK. Most of the Terraform providers, I've not met a single instance that is not, but are written in Go as the preferred and common language. And as long as there is the ability to use the AWS Go SDK to create and manage that resource, it can be used in the provider to implement support for that resource.
Yeah, but who writes that code? What HashiCorp contributors like you, Ilya? What is the process that actually gets those things implemented?
Yeah. So usually there would be a need for a support for something. So usually the community would open an issue. Hey, there's a new AWS resource being out. I don't know, serverless databases, something like that. I don't know. I don't have an example for a fairly new AWS service in mind. And the community would like this to be implemented. There can be a lot of traction. The AWS provider itself actually prioritizes the tickets by likes. You can see the issue template, and if there's enough outreach from the community, um, someone will probably take it. Myself or someone internally from Hashi, depends on maybe if it's an internal customer of Hashi, they will prioritize it as well, obviously. Um, but someone will take it and go look if there is support in the AWS Go SDK. There is not always. Sometimes the services are in private preview or the API is not immediately available. But assuming it is, one would look at existing examples. The provider, like any other provider, basically you need to implement the CRUD, yeah, the create function, update, delete, how to import the resource from an existing resource, and you would implement those functions with calls to the AWS SDK. There's a lot of boilerplate and bootstrap and tooling, at the very least in the AWS provider, but for a lot of these very common wrappers and operations. And all of that is actually based on there's an SDK internally by HashiCorp for creating those providers, and um, basically you're using that. You don't need to really do everything from scratch. A lot of the heavy lifting is already done for you by the SDK, and you need to fill in the blocks. Some resources are simpler. They're just give me the name, the tags, and you're fine. And there are monster resource with a lot of configuration that's needed. Usually the larger resources, imagine like a EKS,
Mhm.
the Kubernetes resource has a lot of configuration that you need to pass for it. Um, but assuming you did all of that, you need to also write tests. So nothing goes out that's not tested. You would have to write acceptance tests and cover as much as you can from the options that are available for that new resource or that new functionality. And a, contributor would actually test it on their own environment. I use my own account. Any provider doesn't really provide you with here. If you want to contribute something, here's a free environment. You can do whatever. So, but they're very helpful. And if you say, "Hey guys, I really want to contribute, but I don't have my own account. Here's something that's I've been trying to work with. It's partially available but not tested." The folks from Ashi, even other contributors, are very helpful, and they'll help you test it for you and show you that whether it's working or not, and give you the feedback. So that would be like the life cycle before opening the PR or before it being accepted. Someone from the provider team would review the PR, give you feedback. You do cycles if necessary. Um, and if all is well, they will merge the PR. And usually every Thursday, a new version is out, and you'll be able to already use it as soon as that new version drops.
That's awesome. Can you tell maybe a little bit more? You said something very interesting about the lack of a real cloud environment to test sometimes the pull request and the
Mhm.
changes. Can you tell a bit more about the small community, or maybe it's not that small community of contributors to the AWS provider? Do you meet from time to time? Do you have some kind of Discord channel, some kind of communication? How do you work as a virtual community team to help each other?
So there is a group of core contributors. There is an internal Slack channel for Hashi for contributors for actually several providers. I'm because I contribute to several providers, so I'm in those groups. There is no real rule of how the communities around providers behave, even within Hashi. Like every provider is very its own thing with its own team, so there's no real um, standard how to work with the contributors as far as my experience goes.
Mhm.
But there, the work with Hashi directly is more like, hey guys, if you need some help, you can reach out to us and we'll help you. But there's no like plan of how to do things as a community or anything, or contributors. Because of that internal channel, we can talk to each other, we can ask for advice. But like any other online community, so like if otherwise we probably have our own channel in Discord or something like that. but a lot of the conversations actually, I think 99% of them are on the in GitHub on the PR level.
Yeah.
What do you
So
think? Maybe we can ask this person. What's the best way? Hey, there was a PR like this that someone else did. You can look at an example. So it's very like look at the example and do it like this. Yeah.
So the collaboration is driven by the features in GitHub that allow this collaboration for comments and feedback and voting and things like that. So sounds like at least not yet the physical meetups or hackathon or pizza being involved in contributing to the AWS provider. No
Not
pizza,
yet, but
no pizza,
no
no
pizza.
pizza.
Not yet, but maybe Hachi will listen in on this and maybe they'll consider pizza.
That can be a big change and big contribution from our podcast to the provider. Awesome, awesome. Can you tell some maybe you've been working on that for like 4 years now, right? More or
Yeah,
less.
yeah.
Can you give like an interesting story of something that you remember that was maybe a bit special, either technically or socially, in one of those tons of changes that were introduced to the provider?
So, well, from my end, I can say several stuff. So it really opened me up to a bit other fields than I was working on. A lot of the work I did that I was passionate about in the provider was actually on allowing developers to work on, well, it's called MLOps, on the MLOps related services, on SageMaker, on Glue, which is not something I did or do in my day to day, but it really opened up the opportunity for me to get into those topics a lot more, especially now that LLMs are super hot, but I've been looking into those technologies for a while. And it really allowed me to open my mind to other solutions and technologies and the variety of the services that AWS provides. And a very notable example is actually service that probably nobody uses a lot in production is storage gateway. Allows you to connect to really like legacy infrastructure on your on-prem and copy it to Amazon. It's a super valuable service to those who want to move to the cloud from a like legacy tape-based infrastructure. And somehow found myself contributing to it and got a lot of traction from people in Amazon as well that were like, oh, that's like a gap we have, and it's so great that someone is doing that. Are you like using it? And I was like, I've never used the service, and like most of the resources and automation I've worked on, but I've never used the service in my life. But a lot of AWS's customers are happy with that, so that's good.
It,
Um,
it's funny that you say I somehow found myself doing it. This seems to be a repeatable
yeah.
model in your career, Ilya, that you decide to find some gaps and find those interesting enough to contribute from your time and to those uh, open source projects. It's amazing. This conversation is basically a subset of what is open source and how open source is working in general, and to see a live example of such a big project. As I mentioned, close to 10,000 GitHub stars, close to 3,000 contributors, and to see and hear from a core contributor is fascinating. Uh, Before we go, I do want to mention, we talked about AWS provider for Terraform, although this is the most common way today to work with infrastructure as code on AWS, the combination of Terraform CLI and the AWS provider. There are other options that are not Terraform, obviously CloudFormation and CDK if you are more in the imperative approach, and Pulumi and others. Just a random question. Do you use any of those technologies, or you're just in the
Oh,
cult of Terraform only?
it's a great question. I've trying to keep an open mind, and I've considered some of those, but I find myself that, well, first of all, we can strike cloud formation everything YAML based like that is just no go for me.
Why?
But
Why?
well,
Because
if you look,
cloud formation is pretty popular. Okay, so
yeah,
it's
yeah,
okay.
definitely.
It's what is your why you have such a strong opinion about that?
Well, first of all, two things. One is the very YAML-esque approach and how you do some of the things that, well, for any other tools in the list you mentioned, you can do for each, and
Hmm.
how you can do optionals, and when you can do conditional things, and it's very useful when you write really complicated modules, at least from
Hmm.
my experience, and it's gaps. I know that CloudFormation tries to fill a lot of these gaps,
Hmm.
but and that would actually not be the main reason. The main reason would be that it's very AWS oriented, and when the sufficiently complicated infrastructure, you'll find yourself wanting to manage things that are not just AWS. For example, you said Datadog earlier, you want to manage alerts, dashboards, and like that. There is a way to do it in CloudFormation, but it's not very straightforward. And I'd rather use the more, let's say, native solution for those. So yeah, it requires me to do a bit hoops in the air to implement non-native things, even though if it works great for AWS resources. And I wouldn't want to use multiple tools. I would strive to use like the least amount of tools to do my job. But for the other things, well, so CDK in the end compiles to either CloudFormation or Terraform more recently. So well, from my experience working with more infrastructure teams, that level of abstraction wasn't necessary. And I'll say one more thing that might be a bit more controversial. If you want your developers to write infrastructure as code, and CDK is a way to push it for them to use it, which is good. But at the end of the day, if they don't understand the underlying resources or what it compiles and how to debug it, it's just another thing they'll have to learn and learn how to do and debug. And I'd rather teach my developers to use Terraform or whatever, the relevant tool, instead of using another layer of abstraction. But I do see the value in CDK. Um, if I can use it directly, I'll use Terraform directly. And almost the same goes for Pulumi. I don't know what state it is now, but as far as I remember, it uses uh, well, at least the AWS provider used the AWS provider code as a dependency, and it wrapped around it. Well, it wasn't using Terraform directly like CDK does when it compiles to it, but it used the same code. So if there's a bug in Terraform, there's a bug in Pulumi, and you have to wait for both of them to release a version. And I know, like, I'm sure a lot of people are in DevOps that waited for a new bug fix in Terraform. We're waiting for it very urgently, and if I need to have another tool that have to wait for it, it's an inconvenience. So I'd like to say I'm very pragmatic in that regard.
Hmm.
But all of these tools are obviously valid and have a large community behind them.
Perfect. You have very interesting and sometimes strong opinions about the frameworks that you prefer to use. I also want to add some thoughts. You mentioned Datadog or other providers that are outside of the AWS or cloud provider ecosystem. I think when you are looking for something, uh, how to approach infrastructure as code, it's not just the framework itself and the providers, it's the entire end-to-end solution that you need to consider. One thing is, for example, OPA, Open Policy Agent, and Policy as Code. Terraform has great support built in OPA. Other frameworks or open source projects work very nicely with Terraform as well. I can mention Infra as a great open source that gives you cost estimations. Those things, Terraform is the de facto standard to use when it comes to infrastructure as code, and that's why you have so many other great solutions that first implement support for Terraform before implementing others. Chekhov, for example, started with Terraform, then added support for other frameworks. So if you go with Terraform, at least today, maybe in the future the situation will be different. you know that you have a big community, not just for Terraform, but to all other adjacent tools that you need in order to uh, work well with your infrastructure. So that's my 2 cents about the discussion of Terraform versus other frameworks. That's my point of view of how to look at those things as an end-to-end solution and approach.
That's a great opinion because also a lot of the people who contribute to Terraform, and you just mentioned Chekhov, and I really forgot about it because there was a time where I also contributed some checks to Chekhov back in the day, and I actually just had resources and things I had enhancements I had it to some existing things in the provider, and right after I did that, I went to Chekhov and I added those checks. So
Mhm.
like it's really easy. Just if you're even going into trying to contribute to that ecosystem, there's a lot of options you can do, and they're really all connected. So yeah, definitely.
Ilya, every minute we speak, we find out about
Fine.
another open source that you like contributing. It never stops. Huh? Awesome. Ilya, thank you so much for being a guest in our show today. And also, thank you so much for contributing so much code and approach and just helping everybody here with a much better AWS Terraform provider. And we haven't mentioned all of the other modules and providers you're working. So, all in all, kudos to you on really amazing work contributing to the community. So, thank you so much, Ilya, and thank you to our listeners today who listen to the show. I'm Ohad Maislish. You can follow me in Twitter or X, DevOps Ohad, and the infrastructure is called podcast, the IaC Podcast.com, or as well in Twitter at the IaC Podcast. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thanks.